6 months ago, something monumental happened in the fight to maintain the separation of church and state. Dan Barker sued President Donald Trump. He sued the flippin' president of the United States of America. Today, Dr. Barker of the Freedom from Religion Foundation returns to this podcast to let us know the results of that lawsuit. This is episode 43 of the Right to Reason podcast, and I'm your host, Robert Stanley. In 10 minutes, Dan returns to us from a fight against the leader of the free world that no one expected him to win. Are you ready for this?
And let me assure you that we are going to take our fight for economic justice, for social justice, for environmental sanity, for a world of peace.
The cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
One aspect of American U.S. life and culture that I think that does deserve respect and admiration is protection of freedom of speech. The U.S. is unique in the world in that respect.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Dan and I will discuss more on the topic of separation of church and state, and he's also going to chime in on his take on net neutrality. Could this affect the secular community in particular? And finally, Dan tells us about his new book that literally just came out. I'm very excited about this because it's my all-time favorite topic, Free Will Explained. That's the name of his book, Free Will Explained. Can't wait. Real quick, before all that, let me remind you that if you're not sharing us with your friends and family, you're dead to me, and we're no longer friends. We can still talk, but only like spies do in those cheesy movies and coffee shops, sitting with our backs to each other at two different booths, neither of us touching our breakfast. So please share us with people on social media. If you're able to do so, support us at patreon.com/right. Subscribe to The Right to Reason on iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, and YouTube. And check out our website at therighttoreason.com. That's enough capitalistic bourgeoisie advertising for you. Grab a shovel because we're about to dig into some Dan Barker.
Culture is not your friend. Culture is for other people's convenience and the convenience of various institutions, churches, companies.
We very naturally, as a cognitive and behavioral imperative, we form descriptions of the world and we try to figure out what's going on.
If you base the design of rockets on science, they reach the moon. It works. Bitches.
They hate you. They hate prosperity. They hate God. They hate children. And goddamn them they we're going to find the lever to beat these people, and they're going to be beaten. Look at her shark face. Have a look at her with that demon face. That's a frickin' demon. We're going to have President Linda Blair, people, and I'm not going to go along with it.
We are not our past, and that's the whole power of logic and reason, is finding out that you can only exist in this present moment. The past is already done. The only thing that the past gives you is either the ability to blame yourself with regret and guilt and shame, or the ability to use the past as an arsenal to get done what you want to do. You have to ask yourself what you really want.
I want to give up.
Well, you're not giving up.
Hi, this is Kelly Clements from the Areopagus Project. Robert Stanley is my polar opposite. We both have the right to reason.
No more should the Republicans ignore this growing threat. No more should the left be divided or take half measures. No racism, no white supremacy, no xenophobia, no bigotry, no Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA.
How am I supposed to talk to you people if we don't believe the same thing?
But don't you see, you've already taken the first step, the hardest step. You're listening.
This is Jason Camo from A Lost State of Mind, and you're listening to The Right to Reason.
Dan Barker is an American atheist activist who served as a Christian preacher and a musician for 19 years. But I think you're still a musician, but you're not a preacher anymore, are you?
Well, I have a different sermon that I'm preaching now.
So how you doing, Dan? It's great to have you back on the show.
Oh, great to talk to you again. And we talked about 6 months ago, didn't we?
Yeah, just about. I think last time we spoke, you were suing Trump, which sounds crazy, but it was something about the Johnson Amendment. How's that going?
Oh yeah, that was the National Day of Prayer, which was May the 4th, I guess, in 2017, in the Rose Garden. You know, Trump had that big prayer ceremony with all these evangelical and other. There was a Jewish person there, and on that day after the prayer service, he made a big show of signing this executive order that directs the IRS to basically ignore the Johnson Amendment. The Johnson Amendment is a part of our law that stops preachers and priests and clergy from politicking from the pulpit, which makes a lot of sense. In fact, most churches don't want to mix politics and religion. So he signed that executive order that day, and on that very day, we sued him. We filed a lawsuit challenging that executive order that he signed, that it was an abuse of power and that, it's a violation of state-church separation. And the standing for the lawsuit, in other words, the reason that we could sue it at all, is that it was only allowing religious groups to be exempt from the Johnson Amendment and not groups like ours. So in other words, we are injured by it. So it went to court, and then the government briefed, and this is interesting, the government responded to our lawsuit by saying, well, that executive order actually doesn't do anything. It didn't really change anything. And basically telling us that we had everything we wanted, that Trump was just hand-waving, because that executive order doesn't really change anything at all. The Johnson Amendment still stands.
Wow. I wonder if they'd be willing to say that to the rest of the United States, you know.
Well, they did. They did say that in their brief, which is public, and you can read it on our website. You know, we filed our complaint, and they responded with their brief. So we consider that a win.
Yeah, definitely.
The fact that the government itself, Trump's own government, own U.S. government, said that he signed it, but it's ineffective. It doesn't do anything. It's not going to change anything. So based on that, we voluntarily dropped the lawsuit, and we called it a win. Because what are we going to force? We can't force, the ink to go back off the page. So, but we can go back to court if we have to. So basically, we consider that a victory, and that the government had to say that they were just trying to impress the religious right, all these evangelicals. And they were all crowing. The religious right was saying, yes, now we can do what we want to do. Well, they can't. And then I'm sure you heard that during the tax bill that just passed in December, the House version of the tax bill had an amendment in it to overturn the Johnson Amendment, to actually do it by law rather than by executive order. And the Senate bill did not have that amendment to undo the Johnson Amendment. We complained about the House bill for all the right reasons. And then during the negotiations, when they had to go to committee to make those two bills fit, that amendment did not make it into the tax bill. So right now, the Johnson Amendment is intact. Preachers and priests cannot do endorsements, political lobbying from the pulpit or from anywhere in their church. And in fact, some churches are using their church marquees to make political statements as well, and that's illegal. So right now, things are good as far as the Johnson Amendment goes. The Johnson Amendment still is intact, although we know there are people in the government who still want to find a way to reintroduce the amendment, to undo the amendment, in which case we would go back to court again ourselves.
I would think that'd be a major victory, as you got them to admit that they're just pandering to their audience. It doesn't mean anything. It's a political strategy just to get more of the religious right to stand behind them. And then they still do, even with, what's that one guy, Roger Moore? No, not Roger Moore. Oh my goodness, that was 007. What was his name?
Oh, in Alabama, Roy Moore?
Yeah, with Roy Moore. Yeah, it's insane. Absolutely insane.
Well, the danger of this posturing, I guess, winking to the religious right. The danger is that they will take their cue from the president and say, okay, we're going to go ahead and politic. We're going to go ahead and do this now. And they're going to put their toes as far over the line as they can, or some of them are just going to deliberately violate it, thinking they have permission from the president to go ahead and do that. So groups like ours are in a good position to challenge those actions because we are similarly situated. In fact, you probably know about another one of our lawsuits which we won again. We won for the second time, challenging the housing allowance to clergy. The clergy in the country get the special IRS tax break. And so the reason we could challenge that was because Annie Laurie and I, as co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation and co-directors, we occupy this similar position within our nonprofit organization that the clergy occupy within their nonprofit organizations. So that's why we gained standing to sue, because we asked the IRS for a refund for that. The IRS denied us the refund, saying that we are not clergy. So then that shows our injury. We can go in. And so the same is true with politicking. If churches are going to be allowed to politic and we are not, the only way the Johnson Amendment repeal might work, and we don't think it's a good idea, but the only way it might work is if it applies to all nonprofits, not just religious. And that's why we were successful on this executive order, because Trump's executive order applied only to churches and religious groups. So if Congress wants to totally repeal the Johnson Amendment for all nonprofits, well, that would be a huge mess, but it would be constitutional. It would just be a huge mess.
Now, the tax on clergy housing, is that kind of like where the church itself owns the house kind of thing? Or is that like their own personal, the minister's own personal property? He doesn't have to pay a tax on that?
It's both.
Oh, my goodness.
So in the IRS code, there's section 107A and 107B. 107A says that if a minister or priest or clergy lives in a house or any accommodations that's owned by the church, then they don't have to declare that as income. Ordinarily, you would. Ordinarily, that would be something that you would declare as income. If you're living, if your expenses are being paid, with some exceptions. The military is an exception. Or if it's forced by the convenience of the employer. If you're going to be on this ship out at sea fishing for 6 months or whatever, and they give you a place to live, you don't have to report that as income. But generally, and in fact, that's what the other side was arguing in our lawsuit, that the ministers are there because of the convenience of the employer. So section 107A, we didn't challenge that. It's only section 107B, which deals with cash. So a minister comes to a church, the church can declare or designate part of their salary as a cash housing allowance to pay for their whatever, their rent or their house payments or whatever, even fixing the swimming pool and all that kind of stuff. And in that case, under 107B, that portion, that money is not even, it's not a deduction, and it's not even an exemption, it's an exclusion, which means they don't even report it as income. It doesn't even have to go on their W-2 or their reporting forms. It's just like they didn't even get that income. So that lowers their tax liability. And wouldn't you love to do that every year? Whatever, if you're paying rent or a house payment, wouldn't you love to say, well, that wasn't income, I don't have to pay taxes on that?
Yeah.
It would really lower your taxes a lot.
I imagine.
So we won. We won twice. We won back in was it 2013, I think. Anyway, and then the appeals court overturned it on standing. We went back in, and it took us 2 or 3 years to reestablish standing, basically to ask the IRS to refund the money, and they refused to refund it with a strongly worded letter, which then gave us the standing to come back into court. And then we just won again on the same merits. And the court had to decide on the remedy, which means what are you going to do about it? If it's unconstitutional, what do you do about it? And we argued, and the court agreed with us, that nullification was the property remedy, meaning that law is nullified. That law is unconstitutional, and it's not effective anymore, and clergy can't do that. The other possibility was extension, meaning that all nonprofit groups would get that housing allowance. So Lori and I and everybody else with the Red Cross and the Soup Kitchen and the museum charities and the science and educational charities, we would all get that. which the court said was just totally unworkable. So right now, and the decision has stayed for I forget how long, 9 months or a year and a half, something. Anyway, until all the appeals are done. So right now, the law is unconstitutional according to the courts.
Okay. Well, thanks for summarizing that. Hey, I'm hearing about a atheist flag all over these interwebs.
Oh, okay. So we have a member in New Hampshire, and a city. Now I forget. You can look it up. There's a city in New Hampshire that has 10 commandments on public property, and so one option is to get them to move that. The other option is to decide if that's a public forum or not, and to test whether it's a public forum. You ask for equal time. And if it really is a public forum, and we're not sure that we can't sue in this case anyway on the 10 Commandments, but in any event, the mayor agreed to allow us to put up an atheist flag on the same property along with the 10 Commandments. And so we decided to use the Dawkins A for atheism, the red A that Richard Dawkins Foundation came up with on a blue background.
The A with the big circle?
No, it's just an A. It's just the pretty A, Dawkins A. You can put it in a circle. So go to our website. You can look it up. It's a nice big blue flag with this A on it, which stands for atheism. And our position is we don't think a flag like that belongs on public property. It's not right. Public property should be neutral.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be promoting religion or promoting non-religion or any of that. But as a way to test the law and as a way to fight back, if they are going to promote religion on public property, then they cannot deny us the same rights. And if they do, then that's actionable. That's against the law, and we could sue over that. So some of the times we put up these signs, not because we really, really want to, but because we're testing the law. And we have signs and symbols all over the country to do that. And where they do allow them, then we say, well, okay, then we're going to put up our signs too. And if you don't like it, then change the policy, change the public forum.
Oh, the red A. I see what you're talking about. I'm looking at it right now, which doesn't make for great radio, but just like Dan said, everybody, if you want to see ffrf.org, and it's right on there, the link to the atheist flag is right there on their front page. That's so cool, man. All right. So you're pushing back in a different strategy. Like usually you would just say, hey, get that 10 Commandments junk out of here, or you're going to have to pay a loss. But now you're saying, okay, let's do a little bit of representation of our own, see how you like it. Trying to make a point.
Well, that's how this kind of law is. It's got so many twists and corners and permutations and even some gray areas. And it's this whole doctrine of public forum, which means it's not your front yard. It's not your own private. It's government space, like a city park, or in many cities and counties and in states, there is a part of the city hall or the state capitol. There's a part of that property which has sort of been either historically or designated as a public forum, where, like right now in the rotunda in here in Wisconsin, that first floor rotunda is open to anybody who wants to come in and put up. They have to get a permit, and they can put up a nativity scene. They can put up a menorah. They can put up whatever, as long as they have a permit. And so if that is truly a public forum and people who walk through that space understand that they're not looking at government speech, they're looking at private speech on government property. That's what a public forum is, or a limited public forum. Then we can put up our sign too, just to show that. So here in Wisconsin, I think it's been 22 years now that we've had our sign up across from the nativity scene in the Wisconsin Capitol in that public forum. So part of the gray area comes where a city or a government hasn't really thought it through very much, and they've been using this space, and either the city owns the nativity scene and pays for the electricity, but then when we complain, they say, oh, well, this is not government speech, it's a public forum, and they kind of change their policies, and so it gets kind of murky, because they still want to promote religion, but they realize they have to do it in a constitutional way. So we're testing that in many places.
That's genius. I understand you got a convention coming up too. Is that here in this 2018, November 2018?
Yeah, every year we have our annual convention. It's funny how that works. I'm reminded of these creationists who argue that a proof of intelligent design is that all the trees on the planet happen to be on a 1-year cycle. You know, when they shed their leaves and then when they grow and then the flowers come out. what if the cycle was different? What if it was 11 months, or what if it was a different cycle? It wouldn't match, and you'd have trees growing new leaves in the winter. That just wouldn't work. So that's proof of God's design, right?
Yeah.
Which is totally backward. They don't realize that the trees adapted to the natural environment. For some reason, our annual convention happens once a year. Figure that out. That's amazing design.
It's proof of God's design.
In November in San Francisco this year. Last year it was here in Madison, Wisconsin, which is our national headquarters. And we'll be at the Embarcadero, I forget the hotel, but we'll be right there in San Francisco. John Delancey, who's the actor who played Q on Star Trek, if you know him, he'll be speaking.
Star Trek Next Generation.
Yeah, that's right. So he'll be there, and we're lining up speakers right now. And I think Robert Stanley might be there. I don't know.
I don't know. He causes a little too much trouble. He gets a little wild.
Is that it?
So
well, okay.
I don't know if you want him around.
So conventions are always fun, and there's always a good bunch of people who are there for the very first time. And they say they're kind of nervous, and they've never been to anything like that. Then they just relax because they realize, hey, I'm around friends. Mm-hmm. I can say whatever I want to whoever I want, and it's really fun. There's a lot of humor. There's a lot of art and music and entertainment and some intellectual speeches as well, and then a lot of not political but activists, state church activists and legal workshops and that. So it really is. The conventions are just a lot of fun.
It's funny what you were talking about with how the trees, seasons and cycles and all that sort of thing proves God. I was asking a guy recently, I said, how would you know if it wasn't? Like what indicators do you have that if there was no God or there wasn't anybody speaking back to you when you pray or what have you, or there wasn't anybody listening to your worship songs whenever you're just bawling and crying with all your heart, singing to your Lord? I said, how would you know he's not there? And the guy goes, well, you just got to have faith. Like, all right, well, I don't know where to go from there. I guess just talk about pros and cons of faith or something. I don't know.
It's like that quote from Dolores McCown, who said, the invisible and the non-existent look very much alike. So how do you know? It's all in your mind. And I used to believe, I used to be a preacher, and I thought it was real. And it's funny, if you're thinking backwards, if you're thinking inside out or upside down or backwards, you don't know you're thinking backwards. You think you're thinking the right way. And one of the illustrations I use in some of my debates is people who use the design argument to prove the existence of God. They see all this design in the universe. They're kind of like the guy who's really impressed that all these rivers were made to flow right along the state border. How did they do that? That must have been a huge undertaking to divert all that water and the expense of it and the engineering to get that water to flow right along the state border. I mean, that's really how much more evidence of design.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Incredible. I mean, that can't have been an accident because look at how perfectly they line up with the borders. So you and I laugh about it because we see that the thinking is upside down and backwards. The borders weren't there first. The rivers were there first, and then the borders were taking advantage of a natural flow, the natural flow. If we were designing it without any of that, we wouldn't use those rivers. In fact, some state borders don't. Look at some of the states out west. They're just these almost rectangles. They just chopped whatever happened. But so when you look at human beings, for example, and when I was a preacher, I used to think the human race is that border, right? And then look at how nature has totally changed to fit so that we humans can exist. How do you explain that? How do you explain that almost perfect harmony of our existence, so that nature around us is fitting us when it's the other way around? We evolved through natural selection to fit nature. Nature didn't evolve to fit us. If nature had been different, we'd be different, or we might not even exist at all. And it's kind of hard to get your brain to flip around. It's like looking at one of those Necker cubes where you can see it either way. Nothing's changed in the real world. It's just in your brain where the flipping. Or when you look at optical illusions, and once you see it, you can't not see it. These things that happen in your brain. And so when I was a preacher, I was looking at the world one way, and then when I threw away childish things and flipped and saw how we evolved to fit the natural world, you can't not see it anymore. You can't you can't go back and pretend like, oh well, it was all about us.
Right.
All of reality was aiming at me because I'm so important. And I'm here and I have consciousness and I have these dreams. So it must be all about me when it isn't. We are basically, we can use the word accident in a positive sense because accidents don't always have to be bad. We are all basically accidents of nature in a very good way.
It reminds me of that old joke. It's not necessarily really funny, but it makes a good point. Is where that city boy is driving through the country and he sees this ranch hand trying to help this calf and pulling it out of the mom heifer, and he pulls his BMW over and hops out real quick, says, how fast do you think that little cow was going when it ran into the big cow? It's all perspective, I think. But speaking of perspective, the way that I became an atheist, and I think a way that a lot of people became an atheist, was right around the Four Horsemen time. Folks like Hitch and like I told you last time you were on the show, you were one of the guys. You were one of the dudes that affected me, that got me thinking differently, got me into a new perspective. But right around that time, post 9/11 and the internet's blowing up, right? Social media's going crazy. We're all kind of learning new things that we didn't have access to by just the library in our town or just the school books that we were given, which a lot of my school books were from the BJU press and religious stuff because I grew up in a Christian school, So I definitely wasn't getting this information, but pre-internet. But now we're coming up on 2018, and we just finished off 2017 with the FCC totally obliterating net neutrality, and it makes me wonder: could this potentially affect secularism? Could this affect that freedom of the message that so many of us that now have a free thinking mind about us are only here because we had that opportunity?
Well, at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, we think there's a high probability that that's true. Of course, we don't have the gift of prophecy, so we can't predict what's going to happen. But it seems to me, and I don't know if you agree or not, but it seems to me that most of the motive behind this move to undo net neutrality is financial. The companies want to make more money by selling different products at different speeds. So it's a market kind of thing. However, it also seems to us that unpopular views will then suffer. The unpopular will be at the back of the line when it comes to what's, you want to make money on what's popular. And so views like ours may be less likely to be available and to be heard if, now with the demise of net neutrality. So net neutrality is not necessarily censorship, but it can lead to censorship by picking who's in and who's out, and who gets the access and who doesn't, who has to pay for it and who doesn't have to. So we are worried about net neutrality.
What do we do with, and it's kind of, the religious right is definitely part of this, but it seems more like it's, that whole don't tread on me, yellow snake thing. The Tea Party was a big proponent of this sort of thinking, but it's the idea of we don't need the government controlling the internet. And it's almost like anytime there's something that we say, hey, we need some kind of regulation on this, or there's a lot of people getting shot, in mass shootings, maybe we should have some reasonable gun regulation. I said, well, we don't want governments messing with our Second Amendment. Or we say, hey, all the companies are about to buy up every bit of the internet and then control how fast your internet is. And maybe they slow down information that they don't agree with, or it's just not profitable to them to have some kind of information that says that their company is doing this to the environment or what have you. We don't need the government controlling what these internet companies are allowed to do, and that violates free market and laissez-faire, and that's what capitalism is, and that's what America's about. No, that whole thing, what is a good response to that? Because it's such, to me, it's reasonable. It's reasonable to have that kind of thinking, right? That kind of make sure you don't let the government get too big. You don't want to go, let it go into fascism. Like, I understand the thinking, but it's such a dangerous response to just resist any kind of government. It's almost hyper anarchistic.
Probably a whole lot of factors playing into it. Tribalism, for example, and just selfishness, me and my family. And as a society, I think this is just my own opinion. It doesn't represent FFRF, but I think that the human species evolved naturally to be tribal animals, meaning that we do pretty good when we're a group of 100, 150, 200, maybe 400 people. You can kind of know everybody and keep track of everybody, and you don't really need much government. You don't need any government at all, I don't think. You just work things out as people, just like a family. You just work things out. There's no, what's the government of a family except that the parents have some thrill. So in a society that has more than that tribal number, whatever that number is, say you're getting over 500 to 1,000 to 10,000 up into the millions, any form of government that we experiment with is going to be an experiment. There's no rules, there's no laws, because it's not workable. You're always going to have these conflicts, not only between individuals, but between groups in different parts of the country and different parts of the nation. And so even the founders of the United States admitted this is a grand experiment. They use that phrase. In fact, they even talked about it as a scientific experiment over our species. And we're still in the middle of that. So laws that we have and policies that we have, which are aimed at fairness and equality, should apply to everybody pretty much equally. I think we all have a kind of basic instinctive idea of fairness. Mm-hmm. You got more than I did, and she got less than me, and I, you know what I mean? But then there's also the greed side of it. So a government really is not a thing. A government is not them up there versus us down here. The government in a democratic society like ours is us. It's we the people. So people who are anti-government or even anarchists, and I kind of think anarchism might work at a small level, at a small tribal level, but anarchism can't work at a big level where we're all sharing the same resources. So when the Europeans came over to this continent, and my ancestors, the Lenape tribe, we did not have a concept that the land was something that would be privately owned by an individual. It was just something that belonged to all of us. And that was a huge shock, right? And the air that you breathe and the water that you drink, and in recently in the last century, the airwaves themselves, TV and radio, they're under some kind of control of we the people, because it's a shared resource. Who gets to own this and who doesn't? So obviously there are some limits on what our shared property is as a democratic society. And now we're bumping up with this experiment. Well, what do we do about the internet? Is that a commonly shared resource, or is that something that I get to own a chunk of and you can't have it, right? So obviously, if the water is shared by all of us, that's one thing. But to pump it to your house is another thing. Somebody's got to run a company that builds those pipes and those pumps to get the water to your house. So you got to pay for that, obviously, for somebody. But it's still, the water is still considered a shared resource among all of us. And so we're at that point with the internet that we're still struggling with this. Instinctively, you and I think would want as much fairness as possible when it comes to this, so that somebody else isn't hogging it and taking away my quality of life at my expense for their betterment. Capitalists like to think, well, tough. If you can't cut it, if you're not strong enough to fight against some other capitalist, then you're the loser. There's winners and there's losers. And is that the way we want to think about our society, as a bunch of winners and losers, or do we want to think more egalitarian and more fairly? So there's always that tension between egalitarian, equal fairness and progress, and what you might call the conservative hoarding of resources and wealth and power and position. And we're always going to have that. So I guess that's if meaning in life comes from solving problems, then we're going to have very meaningful lives the next few years.
Very positive way of looking at it, I guess. Yeah. Well, Dan,
that's just me kind of armchair philosophizing. I don't know if I'm speaking for FFRF, but that's how I think about things.
Well, I appreciate you sharing your thoughts on that and telling us about the convention coming up and success with the Johnson Amendment and all that kind of stuff. I appreciate your time today. And where can people get a hold of you and find you and learn more about you? I know your website title is very hard to remember, isn't it?
4 letters, FFRF, which are the first letters of Freedom from Religion Foundation, ffrf.org. So find out. We're really growing. Since the election a year ago, we've picked up almost 8,000 new members, wow, which is a huge growth. Most of the progressive groups in the country have grown a lot since the last election. We're not a political group, but I think the fact that the current administration is so wedded with the religious right now, it makes groups like ours even more important. We have Republicans in our group. We have libertarians. We have a lot of Democrats. Most of the members of our group really don't want to let us know what their political affiliation is. So we're not really political, but there are Republicans who are strong atheists who are in favor of state-church separation, although they might have conservative views on other things. And in our group, we don't have to agree on politics. We don't have to agree on everything, and we don't have to agree on any of the social issues, except in our group where it touches religion and the attempt by religion to take control of our government. So that's where our success and our focus has been. I have a couple new books coming out this year. In February, the first week of February 2018, my book Free Will Explained will be out.
Oh, decent.
Published by Sterling Publishing, and Stephen Baker wrote a really nice blurb for it. And Robert Sapolsky, you know him, the scientist at Stanford, he wrote a nice blurb for it. Richard Dawkins did not want to write a blurb because he said he doesn't know enough about the philosophy of the free will argument to comment. And he says, Dan, you're very bold to go wading in those waters, because there's a very strong, very friendly, but very strong disagreement among scientists and philosophers, and even between them all, about the question of free will. And it's almost like theological wrangling. I mean, there's just really a fierce, at least 2 millennia old battle going on between determinists and the libertarian free will. So I'm sticking my toe in those waters, and I hope I don't lose any toes in the process. But that's coming out in February of this year.
But no, I don't want to do any spoilers, but I kind of read you as like a compatibilist kind of guy. Is that something close to where you fall?
Well,
the kind of in between, like we got will, but it's not necessarily free, or something kind of like.
Well, I've invented a new word, and I think I have a new way of looking at it. And in fact, a number of philosophers have read through it, and even those who disagree with me appreciate the approach. You know how I was talking about how you can sometimes see things backwards and not know you're seeing them backwards? Mm-hmm. So I came up with a new word. Instead of compatibilist, I'm calling myself an acompatibilist, because I don't think determinism and free will are on the same logical playing level that you would even ask if they are compatible or incompatible in the first place. So, which you're right. In the minds of the strict determinists, that would amount to the same thing as compatibilism. So you're right. So I think you can be a strict determinist like I am, and also embrace freely the concept of free will. Like a lot of people, Daniel Dennett, for example, is probably the leading example of the philosophers who he would call himself a compatibilist as well. So, but I have a different way of looking at it. So I'll be interested to see, and I use music as a big central analogy.
Oh, cool.
And it's all analogy, basically. You know, analogy is, you should not argue from analogy, but you can certainly illustrate from analogy. And so analogies can be a good way of making a point. So anyway, I'm throwing my hat in that ring and coming out as a strict determinist who thinks we can use the word free will, but not in the traditional way. And we can say we are completely free when it comes to moral judgments. We can say that we are completely free to do that. But how do you work that out? Well, you got to read the book to find out. So, and then later this year, my book Mere Morality, which it plays the same kind of game that C.S. Lewis played with Mere Christianity, trying to strip down all the non-essentials to find out what's there at the core. So I do the same thing with the whole idea of morality. What is the basic core of it, whether you're a believer or not? And that'll be out later in the fall.
You do that a lot, don't you? Where you'll take another book and kind of like change the wording on it to get people to see it in a different way, but have it just similar enough that we're like, we see what you're doing.
Yeah, well, like with my book 2 years ago, Life-Driven Purpose.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. That's great. That was a great book. I'm looking forward to the other ones. Is it those two, or you got some more?
Well, those two are contracted, and they're coming out.
Fantastic.
In fact, by the time you broadcast this, the Free Will book will be available, Free Will Explained. And the other one is with Pitchstone Press, which will be in the fall of this year. But I'm working on a big project, which might take 2 or 3 more years to finish, about the end of worship. You know how Sam Harris wrote a great book called The End the end of faith. And there's been a whole lot of books and studies and analysis on why people believe. And there's a bunch of really, really strong hypotheses for that. But there's been very, very little written about why people worship. Forget what you believe, but why are people raising their hands in tears and singing these hymns and getting goosebumps and worshiping this alpha male leader? And I think it goes back to evolution as well, where most primates have some kind of an alpha male or alpha leader who controls the territory and the resources and the females and the power. And everybody underneath that alpha male has to like kind of submit and raise their hands and beg for favors from the big man, from the king, right? So, but it's a big project, and there's very little written about it, actually. And I've asked around. I've asked a lot of other scientists and people about it, and there's very little actually written about that specific topic. So, but that'll be a few more years.
Wow. I'm trying to think. In the just with primates, do we see examples of a form of worship or celebrity sometimes, do you think?
Yeah, we do. And, Robert Sapolsky with his research with the baboons and other primate societies, where the beta males and the gamma and lower males have to kowtow to the ones that are above them. And we see that even in our own society, in our own human primate society. We see this celebrity worship, as you point out, and the big man worship. Even though we have a democratic, egalitarian country right now, we can't help treating our president as if they were some kind of a king. We're still going back to the idea of the royalty and these people that are above us in some way that are like more deserving or more special than the rest of us because of their position. So I haven't worked the whole thing out yet, and I have a lot of research to do still, but that's kind of one of my, early morning back burner projects that I'm working on right now.
Dan was awesome. That guy, he just doesn't quit, does he? He's like a machine. He's a real humanist. And while I was listening to him, another humanist came to mind. I don't know, just some of the things he was saying got me thinking about Simone de Beauvoir. You ever heard of her? Simone de Beauvoir was a philosopher in the 60s, but she didn't consider herself a philosopher. She wanted to be regarded as a feminist, as an activist, as just a human. She made a lot of movement in the school of existentialism and was even, believe it or not, knocking boots with Jean-Paul Sartre. Nice going, Simone. She said, self-knowledge is no guarantee of happiness, but it is on the side of happiness and can supply the courage to fight for it. She argued that everything you are is a result of the painstaking efforts of those that preceded you, and therefore you must recognize this gift that you have been given. You must stand before the cosmos with a constant reminder of your opportunity and the courage to be grateful. You have the duty to follow in the steps of those you have benefited from and give back to humanity. She said it better than I can paraphrase with this bold statement. Each of us is responsible for everything and to every human being. So you see, people, we owe one another. I have a debt to you and you have a debt to me. We belong to one another. If you get what I'm saying, then you understand the quivering heart of humanism. If you doubt me, then good for you, because you are a true blue, steel-minded skeptic, and you should be proud of yourself. The combination of these two conflicting philosophies is what this show is about. And I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed to say that after 43 episodes, I've failed you. I got it wrong from the beginning, and it's time to shut it down. Retool. Get back to the drawing board and come at this broadcast from a different angle. I titled this podcast wrong, and I'm here to tell you right now that you don't have the right to reason. You have the goddamn duty to reason.
Fight for your right to reason at patreon.com/fight.